Hey everyone, it's Erin with Counter Read, joined by Brandon, also of Counter Read. Nebraska just fell 13-10 to Maryland, and we're going to talk about it first. Brandon, I'm going to ask how you are, separate from the game itself. How are you this afternoon?
Separate from the game itself, it might be worse than the game itself. Chose this weekend to potty train our 2-year-old, so that's happening. I won't keep you updated on how that's going. Let's just say it's a struggle.
I imagine people watching this are familiar with that and can commiserate and probably also understand based on what we just lived through with this game that it's all just compounding likely for you. For myself, it's been an interesting afternoon. It felt like that first half just flew by, but then the second half just dragged on. And what an interesting look. We'll save this for another time. I can provide feedback on what I thought about having the NBC sports crew here for Peacock and just kind of the like differences. I've seen plenty of feedback on Twitter and beyond of what people thought of the broadcast overall. It definitely was handled, in my opinion, a little bit differently, even in person, than what I've seen from even Big Ten Network. So you can tell it's a work in progress for Peacock. So we'll see how that kind of hands out in the future. But again, we're not here to dive into all of that. We're here to talk about the game. Nebraska fell 13-10. I want to call it a heartbreaker, but I think a little bit of it is it's for as heartbreaking as you want to call it, is a little bit of a I hate when I see the apathy part of it because I think apathy is the worst possible thing that you can get to as a team. But I've seen some feedback online where it's kind of like, well, this was expected. I mean, that's what some people are saying after last week's loss was great. This team is just back to what we thought it was, and I'll say what I think. And then Brandon, I'm curious to get your perspective because I still believe that this team has exceeded its expectations. Now, to be clear, earlier in the season, I said that this is a 5-7 team. I still think this is a team that can get bowl eligible. It has Wisconsin and Iowa ahead. Either of those games is winnable for Nebraska. Both of them are losable for Nebraska. But I think where I'm at right now for this team is you can exceed past expectations. You can outperform what was maybe expected of you at this point. But if you can't get that turnover piece figured out, the fumbles, the interceptions, if that piece can't get figured out, you're no longer playing to beat the other team. You're playing to beat yourself and to be better and like basically be better than your flaws. And that is really, really difficult to overcome. And that's just kind of where I'm at right now. Is I think this team has a ton of potential, but it's got to get out of its own way. And if it can't, we're going to see a lot of the same over the next two games. And that's not what you want when you're trying to get bowl eligible. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, this was very likely Nebraska's best shot to get that that sixth win. Wisconsin and Iowa games, should be. Matt Rule said it after the game. Wisconsin game probably will be like this one. It'll be a very close one. And Iowa is like the matchup of Iowa and Nebraska is going to be the king of kind of like close quarters games. It may not be a ton of fun to watch, but you got to go to Wisconsin. So Nebraska very likely could be playing that one. Like win or stay home. Might be what we're looking at. I mean, big picture, I think there's a lot of things here. Nebraska right now is probably the simplest way I can say it is a team whose defensive excellence cannot overcome its inability to take care of the football. And it's a tough problem to have. It's kind of a frequent problem at Nebraska across multiple staffs, but it's just you don't coach teams to play this way, and it doesn't mean that you can't. Maybe there's a hole in the coaching somewhere. Who knows? I mean, that's the problem with turnovers. They're just so hard to figure out. the Purdy interception at the end of the game that ended up giving Maryland the football back and what it needed to go down and win it felt eerily similar to the Minnesota interception down inside the 5 yard line, which I went back and looked at that quick. Different formation, wasn't quite the same, but essentially, like, Rule said after this one, that's a corner route. You either expect it to be incomplete or a touchdown. Well, they ran a corner route against Minnesota too, and with the quarterback play Nebraska is getting currently across multiple guys, and this was with Purdy, who we hadn't seen the turnovers from yet, namely because he hadn't played, I guess. It's just I get where I think Rule is coming from, and I also get where I think probably a lot of fans are coming from, because I'm assuming most people are like, well, just run the ball. Who cares? Like, run the ball and kick a field goal. You're up 13-10 then, instead of losing 13-10. And I very much get that. At a certain point, and Rule's been pretty consistent with this, like, you're no longer kind of coaching to win the game, as he would put it. You're just calling plays to avoid turnovers. And that's the balance. And when you're, the game, it's that late in the game and you're that close to the end zone and you have the defense Nebraska has, I very much get the argument for, yeah, just coach to avoid a turnover in this case. But that's not how they've chosen to do it all season. It's not how they chose to do it this time.
No. And I will say, and we will upload Matt Rule's full video here on this YouTube channel. So if you are curious, you can go and listen to his thoughts prior to my question, specifically about turnovers and what they're seeing in practice. And because my question was really, and shout out to Brady Oltmans, he actually was the one that said this would be an interesting question to ask, is essentially, you're seeing this in games. Are you also seeing it in practice, or is it coming up in games and kind of taking you by surprise? And Rule didn't really want to get too far into the weeds on that question, because he's very clear that he wants to take the blame for everything. And so when you do answer some of those questions, it starts to place blame in places that you maybe don't want it to be. But prior to my question, he was asked quite a bit about that, just that sequence with Chubba Purdy and making the decisions that they did. And, he did say, when you get into your second, third string quarterbacks who haven't been taking as many reps and now they're being put into a position. So to what you're saying, you could make the argument of, okay, well, then you need to coach that differently, because you now are into your third string quarterback. And if you are going to get to that, maybe you do have to coach to prevent turnovers versus just to solely win, because the two essentially go hand in hand in that moment. But his point was, nothing broke down quite in the way that it was, long story short, his perspective was like, everybody did what they were supposed to do. Chubba just passed. Now, he didn't say it quite like that. I'm offering that context on my perspective. He didn't say it as clear as I just did. Because again, he doesn't want to put the blame on Chubba or anybody else. He wants to take the blame for, hey, I'll go watch the film, see if we could have done something different. But, regardless, you put Chubba into that situation in that moment, and he makes the read or doesn't make the read he's supposed to, and you end up in the situation you're in. Could you have just then ran it? And honestly, those are those things where, like, the question could haunt him for a bit of, like, what if we would have just done this? I will say, for anyone who has questions on coaching, I would highly recommend checking in on Monday after his Monday press conference, because typically what happens is he spends, the rest of the weekend watching film, looking at those moments, and his answers don't necessarily change. They become more detailed. So I imagine we'll be talking about that again. And I would recommend, if you're one of the people who's like, I'd like to understand the thought process a little bit more, check in on Monday, because Rule does tend to be a little bit more direct on Monday after he's had time. Because he even said, he's like, I don't really quite remember the moment as we were calling those plays. So he's like, I'm going to have to go watch it.
Yeah.
Totally understand, totally respect it.
Yeah, that's a really good note. You do, like, once they've had the chance to process this and go through their post game routine, you do typically get a better understanding on Monday. I mean, it's just, it's just bizarre that you go to three quarterbacks and and it looks like the Purdy move is a genius move all the way up until the last play he gets to run, right? Um, and I mentioned earlier, like this just kind of Nebraska has been oddly turnover prone for a long time. I tallied it up, and since joining the Big Ten in 2011, they're now minus 75 over 156 games. So, on average, they lose the turnover battle by about a half turnover every game. The 5 turnovers today took them up to 27 on the season. Their opponents have 13, so they're more than 2 to 1 in terms of giveaways to takeaways, and this game was kind of the epitome to me of the difference between, very literally, Nebraska's turnovers. Okay, a fumble's a fumble, that happens, but the interceptions, like, it wasn't a Maryland DB. Maybe that last one, Rule seemed to think it was, a Maryland DB making a play, and I'll definitely defer to him on that. But the other ones felt like giveaways, and Nebraska's defensively really felt like takeaways. You had two guys just strip the football, and then Javin Wright made an amazing catch to make that an interception right there on the sidelines. Like, the defense came out at halftime and it seemed clear they knew, like, hey, the offense needs our help. And they went out and gave them as much as they could. And like I said, it's just kind of not enough since two. I mean, and it's just one of these years. It's really going to flip in a big way. I keep saying that. I've probably been saying that for about the length of time I've done this, because since 2000, Nebraska has had 5 seasons. That's 24 years, 5 seasons with a positive turnover margin. In the Big Ten, it's had one in 13 years, and it's not getting there this year by any means. So it's just it's tough. I hate when games come down to turnovers because they're easy to point to and hard, I think, to do much about. It happens all the time. It happens all the time at Nebraska for some reason that I cannot figure out.
I know. It is like, honestly, if you had kind of like the if you understood exactly what it is, you would be the magic. You'd have the, like, you'd behold all of the keys to what is needed, but it's just it continues to just, I don't know. It is just something that honestly is baffling. And I look at it and I see a lot of players that are wanting to make plays. And a little bit of it is that too, that I think when players want so badly to make those plays, sometimes they overdo or overthink. And I think it was on our game day chat, somebody said that they kind of see Jeff Sims as somebody who might, instead of thinking of like the potential positive that would come out of a certain situation, he's seeing it as like, what could I possibly do wrong in this situation? Is almost like visualizing the negative versus the positive. And we don't know that because we haven't asked, but actually it's like a really interesting point of, if you're always anticipating the bad or anticipating that things are going to go wrong, it does show up in how you play and how you do things. And so that's actually a really fascinating kind of psychological point that, again, you'd have to ask the players if it's something that they find themselves doing. But I do think a little bit of like when you start to see players trying to force plays, or maybe they're overthinking because they feel that pressure. The Rule said it. They all want to get bowl eligible. They want to be able to continue this season. And I almost wonder if it's just maybe like starting to become a piece where there's that that mental psychological aspect where you're overthinking things that shouldn't be. You don't want to overthink things too much. And I do think all of this plays a big role and big factor. I know no one like wants to hear it after a loss, that I do think that this team has a ton of potential and talent on it. I think there's areas where like they need to keep recruiting and they need to keep finding additional talent to support that, because there's definitely some weak points of when you get past the starter, there's just not a lot of depth. But I think overall there's a lot to still like about this team. It's just hard because when I say that, someone's immediately going to be like, yeah, but this team is 5-5. And fair, super fair. we'll see. I said this in our game day chat as well. These next 2 weeks are going to tell us a lot about who this team is. It's going to tell us a lot about the psychological place of this team right now. And I don't say that to like, I'm not laughing at that. I'm just saying we're going to find out a lot. Like it's going to be a heavy couple of weeks. And I'm almost more like reacting in, I don't envy those in that position of trying to figure that out in a 2-week time span of how do you get yourselves bowl eligible while not trying to put too much pressure. You want people to just play their game. How do you do that when everybody's feeling the weight of everything else? This is the closest Nebraska's gotten in a while to getting to that 6-win mark. So like it is, I don't know. It's a big task, and there's a reason that I'm not the head coach. So
Yeah, I mean, this isn't meant to be lipstick on a pig or Pollyannish in any way. This is really just like what I see when I look at the season as a whole and kind of look towards the future. Nebraska is going to be very popular in the off season, almost regardless of how the next 2 games go. Like if the season ended today at 5-5, you'd say, well, they went 500, had a rash of injuries on offense, were 2-1, turned it over more than their opponent, and had a great defense. Like it will be a team that, oh, and by the way, 3 of those losses now are by 3 points. Which again, I know nobody wants to hear in the immediate aftermath of the game, but I kind of can't help myself from kind of looking at it really wide angle of just like, okay, like what is this team actually like? What progress are they actually making versus, just the wins and losses? And yes, that's all that matters at the end of the day. But for a program that has not been to a bowl game since 2016, had a really kind of disastrous based on what we expected previous regime. You kind of got to measure it, I think, sometimes in different ways. So we'll see. It would go a long way to just get that win. That way it's, you don't have to read between the lines of that. You can just say Nebraska, through all the stuff that I just mentioned, they made a bowl game. It's a little harder to get excited if that doesn't end up being the case. But for me and for a lot of people, again, like we don't need to worry about 2024 yet. But I'm just saying, like, I think the progress Nebraska is making will be more, or has made to this point, will be more apparent once we kind of know, hey, did they get there or did they not?
yes. And for those that are curious about, like Brandon said, we're not looking at 2024 yet, but if you are someone who's like, okay, let's just talk about next week. There's 2 injuries that if you are curious about. The Quentin Newsome injury, all that you need to really know about that right now is that they took the pads off this week to give them a little bit of a break. He was doing something in practice on Wednesday, took a hit to the shoulder, and it doesn't sound like it's anything to be too overly concerned about. They were hoping he would have been fine to play today. Wasn't. They expect him to be cleared and ready to go for Wisconsin. As for Heinrich, if you would like to see him back at quarterback, he did have an ankle injury. He was cleared to go back in, but the way that rule set is, they could still tell he was like laboring with his ankle, and so they'd like to just give it a little bit of rest. But he had been cleared to technically come back into the game. They just chose to go with Jeff Sims and then ultimately with Chubba Purdy. So if you're thinking forward to next week and who might be available or not, those are 2 injuries, at least at this point, not to put too much concern into. It sounds like both were Quentin is something that they were hoping he could have been available as soon as today, likely next week. And we'll see what happens with quarterback. I know a lot to answer in the coming week. So yeah, we'll let you go. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, whatever the case is, you can leave them in leave them below the comment section of this video. You can also head over to counterread.com. We'll have plenty to come in the week ahead. We will have a soccer update from Nebraska Soccer on Monday that you definitely want to check out. So head to counterread.com. We'll have plenty more. Nebraska volleyball plays on Sunday. We have stories that are in the works. Recruiting is definitely getting underway. Actually, we had big signing day, everything earlier this week. So we'll have plenty more on that to come. So again, if you're not subscribed to this YouTube channel, change that right now. If you haven't subscribed to Counter Read, go to counterread.com and do that. Brandon, good luck with potty training.
Thank you. The adventure continues.
It certainly does. And for everyone else, enjoy the rest of your weekends. Again, leave comments, questions, anything else. We just appreciate you watching as always. Talk to you later.